on the build-up to deployment, we constantly receiving videos and lectures that were just guided for dehumanization, filled with racial slurs, Haji, raghead, etc. And these videos that were shown were completely grotesque. Seriously, seeing Iraqi shot in half with a M240 machine gun, just literally shot in half. You see the blood and guts spilling all over the show. And the room, it would become filled with energetic, "Hoorah! We're going to go kill those ragheads." March 4th of 2004, we crossed the line of departure to move northwestward through Iraq and to our destination a little bit west of the city Aruba. And we went into this town on what we call cordon knocks. We didn't call them cordon searches, we call them cordon knocks. So it would be like a friendly, inviting, "Hey, we'll come out and knock on your door, and you'll just let us right in." That's how we were taught, but it ended up just being cordon bars the way into the room. And ransacking people's houses, pulling people out of the buildings, handcuffing them, putting sandbags over their heads. Whether they were innocent or guilty, nobody really knew. We would go into the cities and do completely opposite our mission. And then some events happened on March 31st, 2004. Four U.S. contractors were killed in Fallujah, and two of them were hanged from the Fallujah Bridge. And on October 1st, we received our marching orders, and most of the entire division and most of the troops in the area were ordered to go to Fallujah to participate in Operation Vigilant Resolve. And the initial siege of Fallujah were, within that month, over 130 service members died. And on that siege, reportedly, there were over 600 Iraqis that died, and over half of them were non-combatants. That's one of the events, the March 31st events, that really shaped the loosening of our rules of engagement. If we wanted to, we could shoot somebody that was carrying a shovel. We could shoot somebody with a cell phone, because somehow they remote control detonate their bombs. So any act, the line became very blurry about what hostile act and hostile intent was. Everything just became hostile act. If you feel threatened, pull the trigger. Shoot them dead. I was a motor transport operator, so I ended up becoming a heavy machine gunner most of the time while I was there. I drove every now and then. But then, so being that, we were in charge of transporting detainees that were taken from the town. Whether they're guilty or not, I don't know. And I don't know where they went. They just went to regiment. But with the detainees, a lot of times they're called detainees. You really can't call them prisoner of wars, because that gives them rights. So they get called detainees. They can be held from whatever amount of time. And I've personally witnessed detainees being butt stroked in the face with the rifle butts, knocking out teeth. I've seen them thrown out of the backs of the trucks. In the daytime, some of the guards, they would it was a game pretty much. They would, in the middle of the sun, this is April, it's very hot. In the middle of the day, deprive the detainees of water, but then in the middle of the night, keep them up all night and just make them force feed them water just so they would piss themselves. And some Marines thought that was pretty funny. I was at a position at a time where I could get out of it, but I didn't say anything, so I'm just as guilty for allowing it happen as anybody else that participated in it.
In 2003, when the war against Iraq first started, I was a part of the invading force. It was up to my battalion to go in on the second day after the Marines. And while I was over there in Iraq, I noticed a curious piece of graffiti on the walls. I read the saying before, but I never thought much about it. And that saying was, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." And over the years, I've thought about what it meant. It is up to each individual citizen to decide for themselves what is just and unjust. And I feel that has been lacking a lot lately. People are too busy with everything with their own lives to notice what's going on halfway around the world, because after all, it's over there. It's not happening here. I feel that this needs to change. People need to start realizing what is happening and how it affects us over here.
I come in, I get a phone call to say that you're accepted for inpatient treatment for your substance abuse, and I look at the screen as I'm being processed through the system here that I was very afraid of, because a lot of the veterans I saw in there were much older than I, and I felt that's what I was going to be part of this revolving door. And on there, the screen was my diagnosis, which was borderline personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse disorder. Later on, I learned it was an eating disorder as well, so I was becoming very angry. 2005. I'm living with my parents because I don't know where to go, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to treatment. The Marines from 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines out of Brecksville, Ohio, who were snipers, and along with others, were in it was separate incidences. They were killed, the snipers were killed, which makes no sense to me. To this day, it still doesn't, because snipers are taught to be evasive. And then the Marines that were killed in the Amtrak and the vehicles flipped over. So what happened is that I had what's called a flashback, but I have no recollection of what was going on. I just had a series of periods where I just had a certain type of behavior that wasn't acceptable to people, to include the VA hospital. And as a result of that, they decided to suspend me and ban me from treatment for 30 days. So after that happened to me, I lost faith in going into the hospital for any type of treatment at all. My retirement paycheck from the Marine Corps after 20 years of service is $207 a month. The stigma of having a label as I do, or it could be as me as well, I can take ownership in it, that some people just don't want to deal with certain things that go along with the pain that we deal with. But I will say this, what I have learned after having 12 different therapists within 5 years. Anger comes from pain. That's where it comes from.
I joined the U.S. Army Reserve because I wanted to serve my country and because I didn't know what the hell else I was going to do with my life. It was very important for me to get into the Army. It mattered a lot to me. And it was very important to me to be a military policeman because I saw a special honor in that. 9/11 happened. The reserves changed a lot after 9/11. Obviously, my unit got whipped into shape and we became deployable. So they stood our unit down after tearing us apart. They took away most of the best of our NCO Corps and used them to plus up other units that were on their way to Iraq. Sent our unit home and told us not to get too comfy. 6 months later, they called us back. And at that point in time, the Abu Ghraib abuse scandal had occurred, but nobody knew about it because most of those photographs and the actions that are generally acknowledged were taking place in November 2003, which is before I arrived there. I arrived there in February of 2004 and relieved the unit that was sitting there. Most of the people that were in the news about that incident had already left the base. We had a 12-hour rotation. I remember when we trained our replacements, about a year later, we trained them for over 2 weeks. They trained my unit for 12 hours. The HHC 391st Military Police Battalion, that is, we're out of Columbus, Ohio. They just got back from their second tour. We showed up at Abu Ghraib, and the thing about it is, it's very hard for me to talk about the prison because of your misunderstanding. And that's a disservice that was done to you by your government and your media, and I want you to be very aware of this. When I tell people that I served at Abu Ghraib and they want to know what that was like, I typically start asking them questions. Okay, where did I serve? Tell me what it looked like. And I hear about these little cells and these little bars. And I lived in a building like that, and I was really glad because we got mortared all the time, and I had a concrete structure where I slept. And some of our prisoners lived in cells like that, where a lot of them were abused. Later on, abused by contractors. That happened while I was serving there. Like I said, I'm a military policeman, and I take a lot of special honor in that. I take that very seriously. When I saw the photographs of the Abu Ghraib media scandal, which was while I was serving at Abu Ghraib, is when I first saw those.
They disgusted me, and they made me question my desire to serve. These camps, they were completely undefended. Abu Ghraib was in a depression, which means all the ground around us was higher. So these mortarmen that were firing mortars at us had increased range due to the terrain. So we went ahead and took all of these prisoners of ours, and we put them in one of the most dangerous places on the planet. And my prisoners were killed. My prisoners were killed by mortar fire. My prisoners were killed by stray rounds that were coming in from battles that were occurring around my base. My prisoners were killed by malnutrition. Prisoners were killed by lack of medication. They were killed by lack of sanitation. We relied upon contracted labor to provide all of our necessary services, and they failed us every day. We would be attacked. It would oftentimes be one shot, one mortar, and we equivocated it to it's some angry farmer. It's somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. Periodically, though, people that did know what they were doing would come by and say hello to us. Their attacks were very different than the other attacks. They would come in very rapidly, and the rounds would hit near each other. And the detainees, who, while I stood there in body armor and ran to my bunker, the detainees were wearing T-shirts, and we had them living outdoors in canvas tents. They had no choice but to explode. But I want to tell you about the security issues of the base. The base existed near Fallujah when the artillery was bombarding Fallujah in both of the invasions of that city. It was shaking the plexiglass windows of my bedroom. And we were right down the road from Bayap, too, right on that airport road that people would talk about as the most dangerous piece of highway in Iraq. So we went ahead and took all of these prisoners of ours, and we put them in one of the most dangerous places on the planet. And my prisoners were killed. We had children in my camps. The youngest one I ever ran into was 10. We had one of my camps, I had an 80-year-old man who was blind. We had people who died from lack of heart medication that they'd been on for decades. One time when I was reviving a dehydrated patient, I sat and I watched a man die of a heart attack beside me. And he was dying because we had overheated him during a searching procedure because there had been violence in his camp. So we had him squatting in the sun for hours. I think he was about 50. He was about the age and build of my father, actually, I noticed. And he died there on the ground from a heart attack. There's so much horror about Abu Ghraib that I'm not even going to try and share all of it with you, but I want to frame it in a way that you can understand. After the scandal happened, the Department of Defense was very interested in minimizing the results of what you guys saw, because that was a big slip. You guys weren't supposed to know that was going on, because America is honorable. America does not do this. We have human rights. We champion human rights in the world. This is something that, as a nation, we take pride in. And I can attest to you with my service, and I was decorated with valor citations over there, so I dare anyone to ever question whether I was the good soldier. With my service, I will say that in the service of our country, I dehumanized people, I oppressed people, and I allowed them to die because my chain of command put me in a situation where I had no other choice or ability to change the situation. I served with great people. I served with some people who did horrible things too, but I served with some really great people. And we wanted the prisoners to know that we didn't hate them and that we didn't know how to make things better. But when you're an E4 on the ground in Iraq, there's not a damn thing that you can do to change a security situation. You can't bring more food to the base. You can't stop the units out there from rounding up city blocks and bring them to you. And you certainly can't make the magistrate process these applications for release any quicker. The prisoners in our camps would riot, and at frequent times we would have numbers that put them at 100 prisoners for every guard we had on duty. The security that we had in these places was 3 strands of razor wire, concertina wire, stacked in a pyramid, and the promise of violence. We had lots of towers with rifles and machine guns in them. And with these mechanisms, we forcibly detained thousands and thousands of people on ground that was incredibly hazardous to their life. And we sustained immense detainee casualty. April 6, 2004 was our first major attack for my unit. When we would be attacked, it would oftentimes be one shot, one mortar, and We equivocated it to, it's some angry farmer. It's somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. Periodically, though, people that did know what they were doing would come by and say hello to us. Their attacks were very different than the other attacks. They would come in very rapidly, and the rounds would hit near each other. And the detainees, who, while I stood there in body armor and ran to my bunker, the detainees were wearing T-shirts, and we had them living outdoors in canvas tents. They had no choice but to explode. And I have seen the result of 100 people being maimed by enemy fire, and not one of them were Americans. Every one of them was an Iraqi citizen. Not one of them was a prisoner of war. Every one of them was an Iraqi detainee who was caught up in a legal system, who was caught up in an issue that may or may not have had anything to have done with any action against an American. These could have very easily been doctors and lawyers and normal people, and frequently they were. I knew many of them personally and intimately. I was involved in a documentary, which I'll plug it right here because I would like people to see it. It's actually not my story. It's the story of a prisoner of mine named Yunus Kuter Abbas. He was a journalist who did freelance work for the BBC. They got wrapped up in some raid. And it's called The Prisoner, or How I Planned to Kill Tony Blair. The website is www.theprisoner.us. But my role in that film is mainly to back up what he says. It's the story of his detention, and I think it's a very powerful story. It was a conspiracy of indifference, is a term that somebody gave me one time. No member of our chain of command wrote down on a piece of paper that it was our job to make these people understand that they were only animals and that we didn't care about them. No single member of my chain of command did that. All members of my chain of command contributed to the situation that left me and my brother service members and sister service members stuck on the ground in Iraq with no logistical support, in ever-inflating numbers of detainees. And we were, the guard force, we were being so traumatized by the events that were happening that some of us did become monstrous. And fortunately, there were mechanisms in place to get those people away from detainees before they did something that they would regret. But when you imprison people, there's this thing. I keep talking about how I really give a shit that I was a military policeman. Those people that were in those photographs, like I said, they were MPs too. I wish they would have remembered some of what they'd been taught. But the thing is, when you take these people, whether they killed Americans or not, whether they tried to kill George Bush or not, I don't care. You bring them into your custody, and then you're responsible for them. You have to evacuate them from the combat zone. This is something we've agreed to as a nation. Well, I know that I served at Abu Ghraib, and if I was outdoors, the standard operating procedure on my base was if I was not inside of a hardened concrete structure, I had to be wearing my helmet and my body armor at all times, 24 hours a day. So we could sleep and not have our body armor on. We could take showers and not have our body armor on. And that was about it. So we were important because we're Americans, right? And it would be bad if we died. But the Iraqis, there were thousands of them. They were compressed into densely packed livestock pens of razor wire where we pointed guns at them and told them that even though nothing about the situation made sense, they had to agree to abide by our rules. There's a couple of Marines on the panel, and I used to tell them that they didn't want to escape because our perimeter security was Marines, and in the prison at least, we're not going to kill you. But if you go against our perimeter, those people aren't associated with the prison, and we had prisoners that would try and escape, and the perimeter defense killed them. We were warned when the media was coming, when the Red Cross was coming, when the Iraqi Ministry of Human Rights was coming. We always knew when they were coming, and we would be ordered to change the way that we did business while they were there. I remember that there was a tactic that we used, that I used. I used this tactic, and I consider myself to be a humanitarian. This is where I got to before I kind of started snapping out of it. But I was involved in, we would do sleep deprivation for our troublemakers because, like I said, we had over 100 detainees for every prisoner, or for every guard, and that was a really hard situation to manage. So when you'd get a recognizable troublemaker, you would pull him out, and you would, later on our policy was more just move him somewhere where he doesn't have power. We'd put him into another camp. But then we would, there was a chain welded to the floor of a Connex box. Those are like those big semi things that you see. People put them on boats to ship freight across the ocean. We had those as like the bases of our towers for the inside towers for the prison. And we had a chain welded to the floor in there, and we would take the prisoners in there, and we would put their hand through the chain and handcuff them there. And there wasn't much that was too brutal about it. It was very dehumanizing, and I remember one moment at night when I had a light set generator behind me, my shadow was thrown over this guy on the ground who is, he had pissed himself, and he'd been in there way too long, and he was real dehydrated, and I could barely see him. And my shadow was thrown across his body, and I had my body armor on. I was carrying a shotgun. And I remember just knowing that everything about that moment was wrong. And I remembered how angry I'd been at that prisoner earlier, moments earlier. He had done something that really pissed me off. He'd started this riot in this other camp, and somebody got hurt from it, and we wanted to make sure he knew he couldn't do that. But in that environment, something like that, we would pound on the side of the thing with hammers and keep them up for days, and we had to be told that that was wrong. You know, like the Red Cross told us that was wrong, and when we thought about it, we realized, yeah, that's wrong. We shouldn't do that. But that's also what was going on when we got there. That was the policy of the prison. The CIA. I have to be careful when I talk about the CIA because I don't know anything about what they were doing there, but I know that they were there. And I know that there were various times when they tried to cause trouble in our camps where I was working, and we would have to call our full bird colonel to come and take them away because they would refuse to leave. They wanted to call this prisoner up. They wanted to put him in a stressful position, or they wanted to give him a gift and thank him for information so that he could go back into the camp and be murdered. And as the guards, obviously, we didn't want that to happen. I guess I want to talk a little bit more about how unsecure this place was. One time, we actually had a sustained assault on our front gate. They didn't really have a chance. I'm not trying to say they almost took over our base or anything, but I don't know, maybe war stories are like fish stories, but what I heard was that it was like 35 non-uniformed infantry. That these are probably people from Fallujah. Fallujah was right down the road. They actually had the audacity and the hatred for our installation that they came over this overpass and began assaulting our towers with AK-47s. On that day, F-16s showed up, and thank God they didn't do anything. They were probably 15 or 20,000 feet up, circling. And then we found out why they didn't do anything. They were waiting for the Apaches, and the Apaches did come. And that fight ended really quickly after they showed up. But this is a detention facility. I mean, because detention facilities have to be outside of the combat zone, right? How is a detention facility's front gate assaulted by 35 light infantry? Things like that happened during my deployment. You have to understand that when that happened, those 35 AK-47s shooting at our base, and the prison camp, which had moved, this was later in the year, was on a part of the base where those rounds were landing, and so some of our prisoners got hurt that day too. We were really lucky that none of them died that day. But I remember just the horror of being in a bunker, watching the sand shoot up in the air all around me, and there were children beside me. In a camp. There was about 10 kids that we had, aged 10 to 15, and they were on top of their bunker cheering that God is great, and they were showing their solidarity for the people assaulting our walls. I mean, you see these things, and you become a broken person. I want to talk and make sure I focus on the media. because I was told that there's somebody else who's going to be talking about the media here, and I want to kind of lead into that. In one of my academia, it turned out to be a great place for me to get therapy. So I went there for a few years and finished my bachelor's. And in a media studies course, somebody gave me a really powerful piece of vocabulary, or a sentence, I guess. She said that the media does not control what you think. She said it controls what you think about. It controls the scope that you question. And when I was at Abu Ghraib, I didn't know about the abuse scandal until my parents called me on the telephone and told me that it had occurred. Or, I mean, I called them, I'm sorry. They didn't call me in Iraq. That'd been nice. But, and then we read about it on the news and we saw all of it. We knew that they had made mistakes before we got there. We knew that people had been arrested, but we didn't know the brutality of it. And then, all of a sudden, the news media was very obsessed with those photographs. And the Department of Defense, I can't make this statement because I wasn't up there, but I observed their actions at my level. And from my level, their actions appeared to be very thankful that there was so much media concern about these photographs and these soldiers, because they prosecuted them. They separated those people from the military. They said that these people are not like us, and we're going to send them to prison. And then I was there, and that policy of indifference, that concentration camp mentality, continued. And I would say the worst of it happened well after the scandal. I think our numbers got up around 9,000, and these people were being killed by mortar fire, and they were eating food that was making them ill. And some of them were dying from old age, for Christ's sake. I mean, we had old men there who were living in stressful conditions that were not great for keeping good health. I'm really glad that people came here today, and really, I think it's very important that this is an archival project, and I'm going to die someday, and someday I'm probably going to stop talking about this, but I do want to make sure that people can know that it happened, because when I came home from Iraq, I knew, by talking to people in the town where I live, where my unit came from, where over 100 soldiers were at this place with me. In that city, people don't know what happened where I served. So please listen to it, and please listen to the other panelists and hear what they say. Thank you.